Hello, welcome to Potladeck. We are on the campground, the campsite that's just across the water from Chapel Island, which is the appropriate place. I think the appropriate place for someone like me, especially on Treaty Day, which is the day I'm recording this, to not push myself over and try and visit a sacred space for the sake of some kind of priority of, oh, well, I'm a teacher, you should let me in. But we can see it, and it is the site of today's article, Elsie Clews Parsons' Micmac Notes. All the attendant provisos need to be in place, that she is using the orthography of the time, the MIC, MAC, which didn't really get replaced really until like the mid-1990s. So we will forgive her trespasses in large part, and also she follows the not only the American way of her era, but the American way still to this day of using the word Indian a lot. And like when we're reading our historical sources, we don't have to forgive, but we can contextualize. We don't always have to, I think it would be foolish to throw away the insights that are had, but that doesn't mean that we can't call attention to the fact that it is good that we are at least trying to do better now. But Elsie Clews Parsons is a good person to just know because she's wonderfully weird. She was basically an eccentric millionaire. She was interested in the, she was an early sort of suffragette, an early feminist, very much a feminist, and had, of course, the privilege that remarkable amounts of economic freedom allow someone to basically do as she wanted to do. Born in 1875 into circumstances which practically demanded that she live the life of a debutante, she somehow determined that circumstances should not dictate to her, but that hers was to be the scholar's world. Her decision was by no means led to an easy course, but one which required resistance and mental independence. The necessary struggle determined the first of what I consider three main phases of her career, the one which caused her to abrogate conventionality and to espouse the feminist cause. This she did in a way quite different from that of the feminists of her day, for she was what might be called a passive feminist, one who used a negative rather than a positive technique. She did not make soapbox speeches, smash saloon windows, or parade up Fifth Avenue with a banner. She simply refused to observe such conventions as she felt were based upon traditional unreason. That's from 1943 when she passed away. So she studied anthropology and sociology, and she taught at Barnard College, where she helped start the New School for Social Research. She also wrote a Journal of a Feminist, which was unpublished in her lifetime. Basically, when she did grow frustrated at the inability to make, or the inability for progress to happen, but there are some really interesting side avenues that she went along before moving on to folklore and anthropology. That basically, deep down, she was interested in the very idea of what forms these traditional expectations. Obviously, as someone who from centers of privilege, from New York, wealthy families, she's still interested in how tradition is putting her and expecting her and women like her to maintain particular roles. So she was interested in this idea of tradition. She was very cutting edge as a folklorist. She was also, as I said, independently wealthy. And so basically, on her dime, she helped to subsidize so many research trips. She more or less floated the American Folklore Society for the better part of 20 years. And it's not that she was appreciated or welcomed in simply because of her money. She was a genuinely accomplished scholar who just also happened to have these deep pockets and this deep sense of altruism. She did some remarkably important research into African-American folklore, and sort of the early 20th century is her most prominent folklorist of both African and African-American culture, Melville Herkovitz, said that her fieldwork was the foundation of almost everything that came after her. She did a lot with the Zunis, First Nations of the American Southwest, which is why in the article you'll come across a lot of cross-references to Zuni materials. She did work in the Caribbean. And yeah, she was just a fascinating person. I have been trying to get the background information on what brought her here, of all places, because it did fall outside. I mean, she had done stuff in the Caribbean, but I don't think she did any other work in really in like the Northeast, and certainly this is her only Canadian work. So what brought her to Nova Scotia and Cape Breton to begin with? What was the impetus? And I don't know. I've got copies of her files pertaining to her visit to Cape Breton. So how the archive houses her papers, how they have floated in the 1923 Nova Scotia Cape Breton trip. But there must be something in correspondence before that where her attention was drawn towards it. She did something else, again, in terms of like contributions to the field. When she was coming up here, she contacted, she was looking for a research assistant, and Arthur Huff Fauset was a graduate student at the time. He was doing his master's, or was about to go into his master's in anthropology. He was the first African American to do that. I'm trying to remember if he had just completed his master's and was thinking of the PhD, or whether this was his master's. I'm pretty sure it was his master's. And he eventually did go on and become the first African American with a PhD in anthropology, and he was associated with the Harlem Renaissance, and he did a lot of work in basically more in religious studies than anthropology, and so that was how his scholarship sort of the main thrust of his scholarship was away from folklore study. But still, a fieldwork-based study, so more it's anthropology of urban religion. But she needed a research assistant, so she brought him to Nova Scotia, and he collected a whole host of material from African Nova Scotians, Black Nova Scotians, in Halifax, in Truro, in New Glasgow, in Sydney, and published an article with the incredibly unfortunate title, Folklore from the Half-Breeds of Nova Scotia, which was these communities that were partially African Nova Scotian, partially Mi'kmaq, and the tales and it was basically sort of a piece of collectania, which was very common as publications go. He then did Folklore from Nova Scotia, which published in 1927, 1928, can't remember exactly what year, and again, this massive piece of this is a collection of contemporary folklore, and she had demanded of him when she was going to hire him that needed proof of his ability to be a field worker, and sort of taught him the role of field work. So we have this wonderful collection of African Nova Scotian folklore to thank her for as well, because she funded and he was the research assistant for her trip to here. I'm not going to go through the article in great piece by piece, because I don't need to necessarily reiterate what happens in the article. But I did want to touch on a couple of things. One of the things is her method, which again was sort of cutting edge. If you read this article, this is about the first part of it is about St. Anne's Mission. And St. Anne's Mission is based around the Feast of St. Anne. It is a gathering of people from all around Mi'kmaq on Chapel Island. Chapel Island is still the place where the Grand Council meets twice a year. It is a traditionally sacred area that was, what would be the proper word for it? Resacralized, transsacralized. The sacralization was transliterated because it also became a Catholic holy site. And so there are Stations of the Cross, there's a Catholic church with the statue of St. Anne. And St. Anne was Mary's mother, right? So the grandmother of Jesus. And of course the grandmother being a prominent and important figure in Mi'kmaq culture. And so hence being sort of one of the key and most important saints. And so every year, around the Feast of St. Anne, people come from all over and gather. And so on one hand, there is a sacral ritual that accompanies it. and because it has to do with the celebration of a feast day. There is then sort of associated with that, not in a coincidence kind of way, but not in a convenience kind of way either. There is the First Nations identity sort of festival. We'll use the word festival in a very cautious sense. A focal point where people gather, and of the many identities that they might have, it is this particular identity that is being foregrounded for the period of time that the festival lasts. But then what's also critically important is that this was a social occasion, and so she was early ethnography in that she was wanted to actually record what actually happened and not sort of the great ideas of what happened. And that when you go and observe a thing, you observe everything. And she even had this sort of, her theory of ethnography. Many isolated details obtainable but perhaps not comprehended at the time of collection should be preserved until a time when someone would know more and be able to interpret them. That's a quote from her, that's her ethnographic method as quoted in her obituary in 1943. But that's what archives are for. That is the collaborative effort that we are all engaged in. So let's get this material together, and then I might not be able to understand it, but I'll make it accessible, and then you might be able to use it in some kind of comparative method, or a subsequent researcher of the same area might be able to retrieve it. There's some wonderful descriptions in here. It's one of the earliest ethnographic descriptions of Waltus, the Micmac game, which I do not understand, but it's sort of described as like a cross between Yahtzee and backgammon, and I don't get it. But I don't get it because I'm really not good at games. I don't get Settlers of Catan either. But very, very early description. And so some people who, that's the problem with academia, is that there's this wonderful stuff out there, but when it doesn't get back into communities, or it isn't even known to communities, there are people who are like sort of now trying to independently find the histories of these things and say, you know what, someone did this thick description 90 years ago prior to anyone's living memory. So that's one of the wonderful things. So she was as interested because she recognized it as important. The social dynamics, the courtship that was taking place, the play, the playing cards, the singing around campfires, which is just as important as the ostensible reason for gathering. We have to remember that it is not disingenuous to focus on the ritual, on the named event, on the thing that gives the rationalization for attending, the reason for giving the rationalization for organizing an entire calendar year around. But that doesn't mean that that becomes the primary focus. That is the opportunity for fieldwork. But also the sheer act of sociability, that it's also the small performances. It's also the micro interpersonal ones that aren't as scripted as these capital letter identities have. So it's not as scripted as this is the Roman Catholic ritual. It's not as scripted as this is what we Mi'kmaq do. Those are both critically important, but alongside, in between, there are just people who share that identity and then fill it in some more with play, with joke, with game, with crisis, with story, with anecdote, and remember what happened last year, because the idea that it is a regular event is kind of important. We do this because we did it the year before. There's that sacred narrative, there's that cultural narrative, and there is that personal narrative about all my experiences, says the attendee with Chapel Island and St. Anne's Mission. I do like how she describes what the formal event is, and she sort of describes not how it went wrong. That isn't the idea. But when you are doing ethnography, it's a great example, and what she's talking about is this great example of type and version. And again, just to sort of remind people what type and version is, type is the general expectation of the pattern. So we have this thing. Let's just take, I often use Canadian Thanksgiving dinner in that, okay, well, it may be sort of like a based on the American Thanksgiving dinner, but you know, when I say that, you kind of know what to expect. There's probably going to be turkey, there's probably going to be gravy, there's probably going to be potatoes, there's probably going to be a green vegetable, there's probably going to be rolls, there's probably going to be a pie afterwards. There might be various forms of additional root vegetables. You know that, you know, it is going to be a larger table. It is going to be, you know, the good cutlery that you don't always use. It's going to be, you know, the expectation that like you wear something a little bit fancier. We know the performances. We can speak in general in terms of Canadian Thanksgiving. We can think in sort of ecotypes in terms of Atlantic Canadian, Cape Breton Thanksgiving, poco, increasingly small. Then you can think of your own families. You don't think, oh, well, what we do is Aunt Glenda always brings her candied potatoes. Yay! Or, you know, the kids do one thing and so on. And then you have each individual instance of how it is manifested in a particular way. So you have the type, the expectation, so that everyone is kind of conversant with how it's going. You can think of it as basically a script. And then when it actually happens, how that script is enacted, and that's the version. And so she describes, she's like, well, this is what's meant to happen, and then for circumstances, none of which are incorrect, for circumstances, things get adapted. And the adaptation is not a negative variation. It's not like, if things were good, we could do it this way. It's just like, circumstances are what they are, because the intent is still there. She presides the crawling, which is sort of, you know, an act, a performance, but with in no negative sense of the term, not in terms of like a disingenuous thing, but a performance of piety, of humility. So you're crawling crawling towards the church. But first of all, it was postponed because of rain, and then the next day, when they were able to do it, it was not. The ground was still too muddy, so they just started from the stairs. And so there is this. So it's these close expectations, and everyone recognizes what was intended, and everyone recognizes that this is a intelligent and pious compromise, or at least it's a compromise that still remains pious, I should say. So, for example, she describes the procession, which also had sort of distinguished guests, and by distinguished guests, it's basically meant paid or paying observers from Sydney, white Catholics, who would come and sort of watch this as some kind of sort of cultural display, and that became. That was a source of revenue. So, and source of revenue to help, you know, subsidize the events. So again, that doesn't describe something as somehow less authentic, but it describes that these arise in practical contexts. And then the war dance, the sort of strange playfulness that was happening in the dance itself, where there was the performance of reluctance. It's like, I don't know, or no, maybe not. And something that can be still recognized as important, as culturally significant, but it doesn't necessarily require that one take it as this, with a solemnity, because there's this idea, because again, if we wish to essentialize the folk, we seem to remove the idea that they can have the same self-awareness that we have. And again, I'm using the language of they in third person intentionally. But people are aware both of the importance and also of the peculiarity, potentially, of their traditions. And so, and they play with it. And this playfulness is a good thing for her to have observed, and it's a good thing for us to remember, because it is not undermining the importance of particular observances if we also point out that we recognize that this is strange, that the strangeness is part of it. What makes us esoteric, what makes us distinct and unique and different from others are these things that are markers of difference, and I can enter into them joyfully and at the same time display wariness about it. And I think there's a lot of play there. One of the things, again, that she was interested in was about women's culture, and it gave her access. We want to think about the field worker and what they have access to, not simply what they have access to in terms of what participants they're able to speak to, although that's a part of it, because we can think about things like the history of obscene song collection, and how, obscene songs often weren't collected at all because the person was seen from away. Somehow, through self-loathing, somehow they were more respectable. They're not going to appreciate this. Women collectors were hardly ever able to get obscene song for basic patriarchal reasons of like, oh, this is not for the ladies. And so obscene song became just this category that is difficult to collect. The gender of the field worker is a condition. It's a condition that, in as much as it can condition the field work exercise. But that's one of two things. One, the audience, the informants that she would have access to, and then two, the fundamental questions that she would be asking. Because the male field worker probably wouldn't necessarily think of the same questions, at least not in the 1920s and 1930s. Wasp. At least not in the 1920s and 1930s. Would not be thinking of these questions. So she was able to dig down and get some really interesting material. She was able to observe the sort of casual observations that took place in the various tents. She was able to sort of sit there with a cup of tea and not be seen as obtrusive as perhaps a male field worker would have been. I'm interested in there's no record of this, so it would have to be, or at least there's no easily accessible record. It'd be interesting to see how Arthur Huff Fauset was treated, because again, they were modern people. They had encountered African Nova Scotians before, so his skin color wouldn't have been a complete mystery or a novelty to them. But on the other hand, being on the island, that might be, whereas they're already used to white people coming in and observing from just up the river. So Parsons was probably more able to integrate based purely on the fact that we're used to them being here to observe, this is what happens, and how Fauset was. That would be an interesting side question. I got to write this down, because eventually I've got to write this history, because no one else is writing the history of Arthur Huff Fauset, so I guess it's got to be me. I was talking about, yeah, so she was able to go to be where women were talking, where they were preparing, where they were gossiping, where they were talking about other people, and those are the cultural performances that are just as important as the stuff that is the focus of the male gaze, the white gaze, the male white gaze was happening, the church gaze, all the sort of gatekeepers of what is proper. They have certain focus, and then there's all the interesting peripheral stuff, the stuff in the margins, the stuff between the cracks, interstitial stuff, which is really where like the lifeblood works of any community gathering. It just happens to be a good version of it. She notes how important play was in terms of joke telling, in terms of in terms of baseball. It's not. Again, they're contemporary people. They're doing contemporary things. She notes how during a dramatic incident, a case of domestic violence, that was both redressed. It was pointed out as being an exception. It was compared to times of last year. It's a dry event, but of course it's not a dry event. People are able to bring stuff in. It was conspicuous. On the other hand, it was conspicuously absent of sort of drunkenness. So it was this idea of using alcohol as a social lubricant, even if it is a non-legal activity, or at least a non-legal in terms of the spirit of the event. But nevertheless, it was able to be easily accommodated because people, because it wasn't it wasn't done in a deleterious way. It was just like, okay, well, we're drinking the way that we drink, not to the point of drunkenness, just to the point of social lubrication, and then that's fine. And then, as I said, her method is to collect. She had some stuff in the archives, but she just said, I'm going to throw this out here in this article as well. So the last bit of her article, a lot of it has to do with It's just basically a list. Collectania. Here's some stuff, here's some stuff, here's some stuff. With some really interesting things. There are stuff about like naming conventions, about the language of kinship, and important things that, again, a male ethnographer would not have picked up on. Things like birth control, things like abortions, things that we, the naive white dudes, imagine wasn't an issue, but of course was a critical issue, because this shit is always a critical issue, and always has been. It's not a late 20th century phenomenon. Now, how do you regulate? How do you maintain control of the body? So these are the kind of these are the questions that Parsons was already invested in asking in the late 19th century, before she recognized that social movements weren't happening fast enough for her, and she decided to sort of academicize her arguments and go into the and find out this nature of tradition that keeps us in these roles. So this is the kind of iconoclasm that she was working on. But we have this wealth of information about how and who and under what circumstances birth control was happening, abortions were happening, stuff you wouldn't have got otherwise. So I'm going to leave the description there, because the article is available, and I believe the article is so old that it is, because it's 1925, 27. I don't have the number right in front of me, but it's within a couple of years of the trip, and that was in 1923. I mean, I'm putting the link in the description, and I believe it's hit the open access, because it's well in the age of lapsed copyright at this point. And if not, I'll certainly leave a link to some kind of description of it. But it's a wonderful article, because for me, one of the things it emphasizes, I say this almost every video, and I think it's critical to remind us, the folk are always contemporary to their times. And when we come out, and this is one of the first contemporary pieces of folklore that happened in Cape Breton, period. It was someone who came not to sort of do some form of retrieval, not to do some form of salvage, but to do some form of actual ethnography. What is the culture like? A culture that can be defined by its sense of the traditional, but looking at what actually happens, collecting what actually happens, and figuring all that out. So, and this is why I think this is a critically important article. And an overlooked one as well. A year or two previously, she has a very, very long piece on, I think it's called Micmac Tales, or a variation of that title. And that's like 100 pages, and it's just narrative, with very little in terms of the contextual information. It'd be cool if something had been produced that integrated both. But anyway, that's a wonderful piece as well, and I'll put a link to that in the video description. So it's, I mean, read it for its detail. Read it for what it has to say about this snapshot, this one instance of something that's now almost 100 years ago. And I think if you read it, and you have been to St. Anne's Mission, and again, I have never been, but if you have been to St. Anne's Mission, from the descriptions that I've received from students over the years of St. Anne's, from my friends who, my friend Clifton Cremo, who's a stand-up, and he describes on the stand-up stage what St. Anne's Mission is like, I think you will find it remarkably modern. It's in as much as these are modern people doing, performing this traditional thing. It is not a traditional thing that exists without the active participation of modern people. And this is just one of those wonderful descriptions of it. So that was Elsie Clews Parsons' Micmac Notes. As ever, as always, from sunny, so much so that I'm squinting the entire time, from sunny Politec, bid you peace. Bye-bye, my friends.